Hello, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the TNT Show. I'm John Drummond, as always, and I'm your host for the next 60 minutes. Oh, by the way, this is our 69th show. 69 shows so far. Work it out how long we'll be at this, because we do a show every week. Except, unfortunately, last week, where we had some production difficulties for which I profoundly apologise. We suspect it won't happen again. It was a one-off, but we did miss talking to a great guest. But we'll have him back, hopefully, in the middle of September. So do look out for that, please. But you know, it's been another great day for British democracy. We learned today that Wetherspoons, the pub chain, which is headed up by Tim Martin, you may recall that Tim was a major player in the Brexit campaign. He was, and is very much in favour of Brexit. Well, it turns out today that Wetherspoons is running short of Carling and Coors beer. Apparently, this is because of Brexit. My word, how things happen in this life. Thank you for joining us this evening. Tonight, we are talking to author, columnist, and reviewer Fiona Rintoul about books, about what's happening in Scotland, and so much more besides. And she is taking your questions live. You'll find, as always, the details are on the What's On guide at whatsonguide.scot. Well, the nation talks. And in many respects, this is your show. We're live, we are free, by the way, and we're trying to, as far as we can, to accommodate your questions and comments. So, since it's free, and since it's live, if you have no license, it's not a problem. You can enjoy this show, and you can enjoy all the shows on Indie Live. Now, to our guest. Tonight, the nation talks to Fiona Rintoul. How are you, Fiona? They tell us the pandemic is abating, but there's evidence that might not be the case. How's it affecting you?
Well, when it started, we were on the Isle of Harris. We've got a wee house that we renovated up there, and normally we rent it out in the summertime to holiday guests, and we come back to Glasgow and we spend the winter up there ourselves. So when the pandemic started, we were just getting ready. I guess it really came to a head in March, didn't it? We were just getting ready to think about coming back to Glasgow. And then we couldn't because of the pandemic. And then for me personally, my father became very ill in March, and he died in April. Oh, so I had to travel down to Glasgow to be with him. And so I was traveling at the very height of the pandemic when I went down the first time, when he was taken into hospital. So that was quite a surreal experience, actually, because I had to get paperwork from the hospital to say that I was allowed to travel. This was when things were really strict, you know. And I had to show the paperwork to the people at Calmac to be allowed to go on the ferry. And then I was driving from Ullapool down to Glasgow, and the place was just absolutely deserted. I mean, it was really surreal. It was like the Highland clearances were happening in front of my eyes. And then, I was down there with my dad, and he was admitted to hospital, and we were able to go and see him for a couple of days. And then they closed the hospital, so we couldn't see him. Eventually they let him out again, but he had to be readmitted. And I thought, you know, when they readmitted him, I thought, they're taking him in. I can see that this is probably the end, you know. I might never see him again, but in fact, the hospital was quite flexible with me, and they let me go in to see him initially for an hour a day. But then when it came to the end, they let me just stay with them. So I was very lucky, I think, in that respect. So I feel very lucky. I know a lot of people didn't get to be with their relatives in that situation.
I'm so sorry for your loss, Fiona.
Oh, well, you know, as my dad was 91 and he had heart failure. He'd had a wonderful life. He was a great man. He died with loads of friends, loads of people, because we couldn't have a proper funeral. So loads of people came out to line the streets to say goodbye to him. And I think that's a pretty good end, doesn't it?
It sounds like a good end to me.
Yeah.
I think we'd all like that to happen at our ends whenever it happens. And,
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So you were that. I mean, that sounds a pretty traumatic COVID that you had.
Well, it was, and that was in the very beginning, and then after we'd had the funeral, which took longer, it was more difficult to organise than normal. After we'd done that, I went back up to Harris because my husband couldn't leave Harris because he was a shielded person. So I went back up to Harris, and then we just kind of holed down up there, and we pretty much stayed there for the rest of the time, because apart from anything else, we had a tenant in our flat in Glasgow who couldn't leave because he was like between places. He wanted to buy somewhere, and the market was shut. And so we went back up to Harris, or I went back up to Harris rather, to join my husband, and then we were there for the rest of the time. And that was a pretty good place to be in that situation. We stay in a tiny village. We had lots of, compared to, maybe being in a high-rise flat with 3 small children, we had lots of freedom and space, and there was lots of things that we could do. We could work on the garden, we could work on the house and all the rest of it. So,
tell us a little bit about yourself, Fiona. I mean, you were born in Glasgow and you grew up in East Kilbride, and
that's right.
And then you went to St Andrews.
I did, yeah. I went to St Andrews. I went to Claremont High School in East Kilbride, which isn't there anymore. It's been turned into a different school. They bulldozed the kind of concrete, brutalist kind of building that I went to school in, and built something else. So yeah, I grew up in East Kilbride, and then I went to St Andrews, and that was quite a, how can I put it, sort of quite a challenging experience, because going from a Lanarkshire comprehensive to St Andrews, where I think something like 94% of the students came from some kind of private education. So it was a bit of a culture shock. I mean, when I say private education, there were people from all kinds of private schools, but there were a lot of people from public schools from really very posh backgrounds, and that was, I did at times find that quite challenging. But it's it's good to learn that not everyone's like you, because East Kilbride is one of those places where there's not a lot of variation. I think everyone's sort of kind of what you might call upper working class. Everyone's kind of pretty much the same. There's no real dreadful poverty, and there's very little kind of really excessive wealth either. So I was used to something quite flat in terms of social class, and I went into something that was not like that.
And as part of that, your St Andrews course, you spent time as a teaching assistant in Paris. How was that?
It was, to be honest, it was a little bit disappointing. I think I absolutely desperately wanted to go to Paris. I was very impressed by Simone de Beauvoir when I was a kid, when I was growing up, and I read all her books, and I thought she was amazing. I'm not sure I quite think that now, but so I went to the school. I was teaching in the school. I was a teaching assistant in the school where she had been a teacher in Paris. So this was like perfect, But in fact, when I got there, it was quite difficult. It was very difficult to make friends in Paris, and it was very, very expensive. So it was, which was part of the reason why it was difficult to make friends, because you didn't have any spare money, so you couldn't sort of join a badminton club or any of the things you might normally do. I think also at that age, you perhaps don't have the don't realize quite so well what you should do to become integrated. But I found it quite difficult and a slightly lonely experience at times. And I did make friends, but very few of them were French, which was a huge disappointment to me. I made a lot of German friends, one of whom is still a very good friend of mine to this day. So it wasn't all bad, but it was. I find it disappointing in some ways.
How was your French? I mean, did you feel comfortable speaking?
I certainly did by the end. By the end, I would say I was completely fluent. And I can even remember people going to visit a friend of mine who was an assistant in another part of France, and people sort of giving me a hard time because of my Parisian accent. Because the Parisians are unloved, in other parts of France generally. And having lived there for a year, I can sort of slightly see why.
And then you spent some time in China?
I did. That was after university. Yeah, when I left university, I went to teach English in China in a place called Tianjin, which is sort of, I don't know. So at that time, it was probably about an hour and a half southeast of Beijing on the train, but the train wasn't very fast, so I'm not sure exactly how far it is as the crow flies.
And how did you find integration into a Chinese setting?
Well, it was in some ways it was easier than it was in Paris, but it was the boundaries were clearer, but it was a very interesting experience to go and live in China at that time. It really was, and I think it's one of the things in my life that I wouldn't change. But it was a challenging experience. But I think that's it would be a challenging experience. It's it's a completely different culture. And it was a very interesting thing to see how completely different the culture was, and how difficult it was to do the right thing, because you just didn't understand what people wanted or expected. So I mean, an example would be my friend and I, who were at the same college, we sort of did something that we shouldn't have done, and we got found out, and so we said, okay, it's a fair cop. We're terribly sorry. We shouldn't have done that. We realise that now. We won't do it again. We apologise profusely. And that was completely the wrong thing to do, because by doing that, we were losing face, and that was embarrassing for everyone. There we were, standing in a room, faces all over the place, and that was mortifying. We had mortified everybody, and it was terrible, and that was completely the wrong thing to do. So it's very difficult. Of course, you learn, but it's quite difficult to navigate that.
What would have been acceptable? For example, would it have been acceptable to say it may have appeared to you that we did these things?
I'm not quite sure. I think we should have come up with something. We should have come up with some kind of reason, maybe, why we did it, that could have been plausible. And then we could all have smiled and saved face and moved on. But we would have understood at the same time that we shouldn't have done it. We shouldn't do it again. So
I've only had a brief experience of China. Mainly, I mean, I've been to Shanghai on business and Hong Kong. But my wife and I went to Beijing a couple of 3 years ago. And one of the things that astonished us was how, I don't know how to describe it, but I guess you'd have to say the capitalist system has somehow captured a whole chunk of what I thought. I mean, I was expecting a rigid communist arrangement.
Yes.
But on one occasion, we left the hotel and went, we were looking for a place to eat. And there was a supermarket in a basement, and as we were trying to find our way to the supermarket, we ended up going up instead of down. The escalators weren't marked as we had hoped, and we ended up on a floor, literally a floor, which was completely full of young people standing on soapboxes selling things.
Right, yeah.
And it took my breath away. And eventually somebody shouted to us in English, "Would you like to buy?" And for the life of me, I can't remember. I think it was a watch.
Right.
And I thought, and the guy said, come. You come closer, I give you a better deal. And and we were surrounded by hundreds of people, all selling things.
Yes.
I mean, it was like communism had never happened.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because I mean, when I was there, it wasn't like that. I was there in 88, 87 to 88, actually. And it wasn't like that. It was still very much communist, and most people wore mouth suits, and it was very, very rigid. I've never seen a society that was so rigid, because people used to sometimes come from the Soviet Union and say, "Oh, it's freer here," because there wasn't the same kind of police presence. But basically everyone was watching everybody else. So there would be, in every building, there would be a kind of building committee, and they were watching what you did and going through your rubbish and all the rest of it. And at your workplace, you would be part of a work committee. And it was, for example, if you wanted to have contraception, you got that through your work committee. And if you wanted to get married, that would have to be kind of approved by the work committee. You couldn't travel unless it was approved by your work committee. So it was a fantastically rigid system. I'm sure it's not like that now. And as you say, they've embraced capitalism with gusto. So while still claiming to be a communist country, so it's it's an interesting anomaly, really, isn't it? It's still a dictatorship. I guess the one thing they've not embraced is democracy, and I don't know if they ever will.
It's fascinating. I found the same thing in Vietnam. I was expecting, you expect a communist country.
Yeah.
But when we were there, it was, wide open. Everybody was selling everything. Yeah. You could buy whatever the heck you wanted, whenever you wanted it. It it struck me as more like the Wild West than the Wild East.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because in China they tend to be, I mean, traditionally they were big gamblers, and now that there's a stock market, people tend to go for really risky stocks and take a gambling approach to investment, where normally when a country adopts investment and people start investing in equities, normally you have to persuade them to take a little bit more risk, but that's not been the problem in China. They've had to persuade them to please don't take so much risk because you're going to lose all your money. So.
You were talking there about dictatorships and a rigid system. Now, you spent some time in the Democratic Republic in Germany.
Yes.
I think you were based in Leipzig.
I was, yeah.
Karl Marx University. How did you find working and living there?
Well, I enjoyed it much better than I did living in Paris, to be frank. And it was very easy to get to know people. I mean, it was a paradise of freedom compared to China, but obviously there were problems in that society. I met lots of really interesting people, because if you were a Westerner there, everybody wanted to speak to you and get to know you. So I got to know lots of East German people. I spoke loads and loads of German, which I probably wouldn't have done if I'd gone to, Erlangen or somewhere like that, because all the Germans would have spoken really good English, whereas in East Germany, that wasn't the case. So it was, from a linguistic point of view, it was the ideal place to go. And it was also, I just found it fascinating to be in that society and to see how it worked and to see how people kind of adapted as well. And, there was something, there were lots of problems in East Germany, but it kind of wasn't all bad. It was, in a way, it was somewhere where people kind of made their own fun, because there was lots of things that you couldn't get, or that you couldn't get as good as you might like, so, but there was quite a vibrant sort of scene and quite a vibrant kind of artistic underground and stuff like that. So it was an interesting place. I found Leipzig. Leipzig's a great city today, and it was a great city then as well. It was very run down and polluted, but it was still a great place.
Do you see any parallels? This is a leading question. Do you see any parallels between that regime and what you see unfolding in the UK with the restrictions on freedom of expression, measures being taken to disenfranchise people in the most recent legislation?
I do, yeah, and I personally am a very firm believer in freedom of speech, and I think it's a hiding to nothing to try to control what people think and what they say. Obviously we have to have some controls, we can't allow hate speech, but with that, I think we should try to we should try to encourage freedom of expression as much as possible. And I think that all this kind of stuff that we've had recently with no platforming, and you can't say this and you can't say that, and you're a bigot if you think this, I think it's all very worrying and actually quite dangerous as well. And there's a kind of looseness with language that I find very worrying. So people are talking about, you're trying to erase me if you hold a point of view that they don't agree with. And erasure is what the Nazis tried to do in Germany during the Third Reich. That's erasure. What are we going to say if what words are we going to use if we ever, God forbid, that we should ever get to a point like that again? So people are using this kind of overblown language, I think, to try to shut people down, and it's on both sides of the political divide, because on the right wing side, you get all these people who don't want anyone to say anything critical about Churchill, or who don't want the National Trust to look into the history of colonialism connected to their properties, and that's not doing a bit of research and finding out some more. That's rewriting history and denigrating Britain. And I think that's, basically the people who are criticizing that kind of research are just unable to face facts. But you get it, unfortunately, on the more progressive left side of politics at the moment as well. And I think this moment right now is it's kind of reached a sort of peak, and it's really quite worrying.
I watched this sort of thing develop in the States. I used to go back and forth quite a bit. And one of the things that in particular I found odd was how the word liberal became almost a swear word.
Yes, yeah. I remember that during the, what was his name, Dukakis, during the Dukakis campaign, they kept accusing him of being a liberal. And I kept thinking, he kept trying to explain how he wasn't a liberal when he clearly was a liberal. And I kept thinking, why doesn't he just say, yes, I'm a liberal, there's nothing wrong with that,
To me, it was down to the fact that, exactly as you said, that the word had become altered.
Yes.
It was a different word. It didn't mean what I thought it meant.
Yeah.
So I had to ask Americans, why is this such a very bad word?
Yeah.
Why is it? Why, if you describe someone as a liberal, that's something they ought to be ashamed of.
Yes. Yeah.
And they had to sit down and painstakingly take me through how that change took place. I mean, I was familiar with some of it, but not the profundity of it. And it also worried me, pretty much as you've just said, how the language becomes subverted.
Yes.
Such that it makes it very difficult for us to use pretty much any words.
Yeah.
Eventually, if you allow this thing to continue.
Yeah, and people are saying now, this is hatred and ignorance and bigotry, when what they mean is, I don't agree with that, and that's a dangerous path. I really think it is.
Now, you write for the Times as well. You write a column for the Times.
Yeah, I've been doing that recently, yeah.
And I've read it a number of times. I very much enjoy it. What was your brief? I mean, because the Times isn't necessarily noted for trumpeting independence views.
Well, I think they wanted to expand the number of voices that they have, or the kinds of voices that they have. So they wanted someone to come in and write from a pro-independence point of view, but not, not a headbanger, I think was the word that was used. So, they wanted sort of sensible pro-independence commentary, and I think they're to be commended for that, because they, and the editors to be commended for that. They wanted to be more inclusive in the voices that they had on their comments pages, and that's really what all newspapers should be doing. They should be, and I think that the Herald's doing that quite a bit now as well. I noticed they've got a lot of really quite different commentators who take very different views, and I think that's good, and particularly in the context of what we were just discussing about people being shut down and certain views almost being, disallowed. I think it's good to have as many views as possible, and that's how you get. I mean, what is truth? There's no such thing really, but that's how you get some kind of idea of truth. I think is by hearing all the, as many different voices as possible, and I think we should encourage that. So I think it's good that they. Obviously, it's good for me, but I think hopefully it's good for the for the paper as well. They asked me to contribute.
Long may it continue, and I hope others will grab the Times when you're writing. It's really good stuff, folks. I strongly recommend it. In terms of looking at the sort of broader picture, what was it that first? When were you first attracted to independence, and why?
Well, I think I came from a family that was pro-independence, certainly in terms of my parents. I don't think perhaps in terms of the wider family, but in terms of my parents, my grandfather, I know he used to, in later life, how people come round and ask you how you're going to vote. And he used to always say to all of them, oh, I'm going to vote for you. And then the Tories would say to him, would you like us to send a car, Mr. Bruce? And he would say, oh, yes, that would be great. So they'd send a car, and then he'd go and vote for the SNP. So he was an independence voter. And my parents were both sort of pro-independence, way back before it was a thing or a big thing, and my dad, he only told me this sort of comparatively recently, I think after the independence referendum, that he had signed, the covenant for home rule that was brought out, I think, at the end of the 1940s, when he would have been just about 20 or 21. So it was kind of in the family, as it were. But I think I've been on a bit of a journey with it as well, because it's, when I was young, it seemed like something that was impossible and that would never happen. And people were constantly saying that it's completely impossible. What a ridiculous idea, And we've obviously, as a country, we've moved from that position. but also I think when in the 90s, when the Labour government came to power, when the Blair government came to power, and they introduced devolution, it didn't seem as necessary because I felt quite kind of represented by that government. There were a lot of Scottish people in it. There were a lot of different kinds of people. It was a very sort of quite diverse compared to what we'd had before. So I sort of, didn't mind that. And then things changed, I think, swung in a way that perhaps, we couldn't have predicted. And now it feels very uncomfortable to me to be in the UK, and I can't really see how that's going to change. It's hard to see the government really changing, and we're sort of drifting ever further to the right. And then there's Brexit, which I think was, a huge folly.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, there's some people would argue, some people on the centre right would say that's an argument against independence. Because if you look at the chaos that ensued over Brexit, then their argument is this would happen 100-fold under independence.
Yeah.
What's your take on that?
Well, I think they didn't prepare for Brexit because they didn't think it was going to happen. I mean, I think Boris Johnson, you could see it on his face, the day after the referendum. He didn't expect to win, and I don't think he wanted to win. So there was he's not exactly Mr. Preparedness anyway, but, I don't think that they really prepared. And then they got themselves in this mess where they had these kind of red lines that made it impossible to have a good outcome. So I think the lessons from that would be don't do that. Prepare for what you're going to do. I mean, there is a limit to how much you can prepare, because there's certain questions that can only be answered once independence is a fact, or once Brexit is a fact. But I think if we were to have another referendum, a sort of real preparation would be essential, and trying to address all these difficult questions about currency and stuff like that, which I think can be addressed, and perhaps also laying the groundwork with, internationally for how we would interact with the rest of the world in a post-independence world. But also, I mean, things are a mess anyway, so we might, in a way, this could be a good time, we might as well just, it's not like everything's all nice and stable and okay, we might as well just go for what we want, and get the right outcome from the mess.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that. We've got a guest on next week, James Hawes, and he's written a number of pieces in Prospect magazine and elsewhere, and he compares the UK to the end of empire.
Yes.
He said his contention is, broadly speaking, and I hope I'm not paraphrasing him too much, he's saying this is the way these things work. Anybody who's read a history book will know that empires don't necessarily, they implode rather than explode.
Yeah, and nothing's forever, is it? I'm sure a lot of Romans thought the Roman Empire would go on forever, but it didn't, and nothing's forever, and things change. And, if you look at the United Kingdom, if you, sort of look at it, try to get rid of all everything you've kind of learned in school and all your kind of preconceptions. If you really look at it, it's rather a weird place. It's rather strange, having these three countries and then a bit of another country. That's a very weird way to organize a polity, I think.
Yeah, I spend a fair bit of time outside the country, and certainly over the last number of years, and it's always struck me as bizarre. And trying to describe the UK to people who are unfamiliar with it is an exercise in challenging their imaginations in many cases, because they look at you without comprehension. I mean, how does this work?
Yeah.
They say, well, if you did that, would it be unconstitutional? To which I have to say, well, it depends.
Yes.
Say, I know. What do you mean it depends? Surely it's written down somewhere. Surely you know. And they look at you as if they're talking to a child.
Yes, and I think a lot of these people were unaware of a lot of these things. I mean, I think a lot of people weren't even really aware that it was a union, and a lot of the history had been forgotten. I mean, it's pretty clear that some people in the Conservative government had forgotten the history in Ireland, or they wouldn't, I assume and hope, have behaved as they did in the Brexit negotiations. And now we've been reminded of all that, and all that's kind of been laid bare, and we can sort of see the scaffolding of this weird edifice, and it's like, I mean, would you build that if you were starting from scratch? Would you create a country like that? I don't think so. And if you look at Ireland, I mean, it's not for me to say what the future of Ireland will be, but it's very hard to see. I think it's very hard to see Northern Ireland remaining part of the United Kingdom, for all that much longer.
Well, the demographics are clear.
Yeah. And also, it's just kind of bizarre.
Well, it's a bizarre outcome to a very British approach to constitutional change.
Yeah.
In other words, the British view is that it's undesirable to make radical change. Yeah. However, that doesn't mean you can't tweak.
Yeah.
So there's an enormous amount. The British state loves to tweak. In other words, they tweaked Northern Ireland. They tweaked devolution, and there was no devolution offer to England, but there was a bit offered to Scotland, a bit offered to Wales, and a bit offered to Northern Ireland. They were all different. There was no consistency. Anyone looking at it from overseas would say, "Why didn't you just do the same thing everywhere? If you felt it was necessary to do it at all, why didn't you do it right across the board? Why didn't you have devolution for England, Wales, and Northern Ireland and Scotland? Surely that would have made more sense." Yeah. And of course, the answer is, well, but we didn't want to, upset the horses. I mean, if we'd done something up front, we'd have had to explain it to vast numbers of people and try and get their support. And frankly, we prefer just to do it the way we've done it. And all we had to do was have a vote in one or two places. And we didn't want to particularly didn't want to disturb folks in the southeast, because this would have been tiresome. I mean, nobody's interested in it, and why should we force them to be interested?
Yeah. And I think it's, as soon as they reconvened the Scottish Parliament, this issue was always going to come up, because does it make sense to have two parliaments for one country? I'm not sure it does, So in a way, we probably, at some point, we're going to have to decide. We're going to have to go one way or the other.
Yes, I mean, it wouldn't be unfair to say the Conservative Party has been captured by the ERG group, and it has really no sense of the historicity of the island. They take a rather narrow English nationalist perspective on it, and for them, the Scottish Parliament is so much frippery and nonsense.
Yeah,
and therefore it ought to be abolished ASAP. It's just a question of how one does it without causing Scots to sort of march down the streets and stuff like that. But even that would be a small price to pay, I suspect, for some of them.
Yeah. And I think that, that probably will become the choice, and then that will be a different choice from, do you want, a parliament with quite a few powers, but could do with a few more powers, or, do you want independence if it's a choice between, do you want a parliament in Edinburgh or a parliament in London? That's a different choice.
Let me ask you another leading question, if I may. What's your assessment of Nicola Sturgeon? Do you think she's doing a good job, or an indifferent job, or a fair job, or what?
I think she is broadly doing a good job. I think she broadly did a good job during COVID. I mean, I like her. I admire her. I think the government is starting to feel a little bit stale now, and we're heading into a period of kind of, it feels a bit like the doldrums, doesn't it? It's where what's going to happen next. It all feels a bit flat, and maybe that administration has been in power for too long, and I think one of the problems we've got is, because people are voting along constitutional lines at the moment, it's hard to conceive of another administration unless we had independence. And to me, that would be one of the main advantages of independence, that then we can vote for whoever we want. We don't have to vote along constitutional lines. We can vote on policies and on what kind of country we want to have.
Yeah, I would agree with much of that. I mean, I think all governments become ossified over time.
Yeah.
And they actually, a bit like the Cultural Revolution in miniature, you really have to shake things up from time to time.
Yeah.
It seems to me, history tells us that if you don't, then somebody else will shake them up for you. I mean, that's been the human condition over centuries. You either do it yourself or somebody does it to you. And you can't afford to stray too far from what the people feel is important to them. In that sense, do you think I'm hesitant to use the word coalition because I'm not sure it's entirely appropriate, but with the connection between the Scottish government, including Greens now, do you think that's a move in the right direction, or do you think it's perhaps a sideshow?
I'm not really excited about the coalition with the Greens. I mean, I think it's good that the Greens exist and that they're pushing for us to deal with climate change, which fairly obviously we have to do. But they're activists. I think they might, struggle with the kind of responsibilities that they're now going to have. And I personally don't think that the kind of change that we need to make to tackle the climate crisis is going to come from the Green Party or from environmental groups. It's going to come from the Communist Party in China deciding this is a real problem and we need to introduce policies to deal with it, which they're doing. It's going to come from business realizing, that this is going to affect our profits, therefore we need to do something about it. And also from investors. I mean, I was originally an investment journalist, and investors are taking this issue really seriously now. I mean, there is a bit of greenwashing, there can be problems around the edges, but they're really taking it very seriously. When I first started reporting on investments, people kind of laughed at the idea of ethical funds. It was for tree huggers kind of thing, and now they're absolutely all embedding what they call environmental, social, and governance policies in their investment funds, and pension funds are demanding that. Institutional investors are demanding it, and I think that's probably where real change will come from. I mean, it's good to have activists. It's good to have people like Extinction Rebellion, highlighting the issues. Although sometimes I feel with things like Extinction Rebellion, it's kind of cool as well, and so it's good to have those things, but I think that's probably not what will create real change. And in terms of the coalition, not exactly a coalition with the Greens that the Scottish government has. I'm a little bit concerned personally about the Greens' position on sex-based rights. It's not even that I'm concerned about their position, actually. I mean, I don't share their view, but that's okay. What I'm concerned about is their intolerance of the opposite view. And I think that's dangerous.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people might agree with that. I think also to your earlier point about how people function as ministers, it's a very different job to the conventional job of not being in government and expressing a view about government behaviour, actions, or policies. Once you're part of government, you become institutionalized. I think it's inevitable. Yeah. Not just this government, or not just Westminster, but any government.
Any government, yeah.
If you've read books like Locked in the Cabinet and stuff like that, you soon realise.
And you have to be pragmatic, and they're not pragmatic, I don't think.
I think that's the key, because you're then exposed to advice from a range of different sources. And there's also the government line that has to be adhered to, sometimes extremely rigidly. And that puts enormous stress on people who are perhaps used to a much more free-flowing environment.
Yeah.
It seems to me, which brings its own challenges.
Yeah, I mean, it'll be interesting to see how it works out. But also, I mean, Patrick Harvey's been in the Scottish Parliament for a long time, so it doesn't feel like exactly like a fresh face, and they have got a tiny percentage of the popular vote. So That's maybe slightly weird as well, but there's no one else to have a coalition with. I can see that. So.
And intriguingly too, I just don't understand the position of the opposition now. I think Nicola Sturgeon rather cleverly invited the Labour Party to come along and join in the fun, and was summarily rejected. And I thought, well, that was a dumb thing to do. Don't. If somebody offers an olive branch, the last thing you should be seen to be doing is trampling all over it. That'll stand you in no good stead whatsoever. You need to be more politically adept than that. But simply dismissing the offer out of hand, I thought was incredibly silly. But then again, I just don't know where the Labour Party is coming from right now.
I know, and they just seem to be incapable. I mean, it would be good to have a functioning Labour Party that was a real challenge to the government, but they just seem to be incapable of overcoming their kind of Scotland issue, whether it's the Scottish Labour Party or the UK Labour Party. They just don't seem to be able to understand what it was that they did that lost them so much support after the referendum.
They should come and talk to you.
They should, yeah.
Well, if they're not prepared to do that, they ought to read your columns, because there's a lot of helpful advice there. And it does seem to me that they're desperately in need of a much more, I don't know how to describe it, perhaps a much more profound way of thinking about the constitutional question.
Yeah. That's absolutely correct. And they can't just keep saying, as they do, particularly in the Labour Party, the UK Labour Party, narrow nationalism. They think, we'll use the nationalist word and that'll be the end of that. And that's not a response to the profound changes that have taken place in Scotland. And they just seem to be incapable of understanding that, or of understanding, because I felt during the referendum campaign they were extremely negative about Scotland, and that did them so much damage, and they don't seem to be able to kind of recover from that. Instead, they just keep insulting people, which generally doesn't work that well in politics, I'm told.
Now, Fiona, you're well travelled, as we know and as we've talked. What's your take on Afghanistan right now?
Oh goodness! I mean, that's such a difficult question. I mean, I think nobody, for centuries, nobody has made a success of trying to subdue Afghanistan, have they? And it's terrible to see these scenes of people in distress and the Taliban taking over, and to know what that will mean for people, and particularly for women. And it would seem that it's been handled in quite a shambolic way, but I'm not sure if fundamentally there was a choice in terms of the withdrawal. I'm not sure that they could have not withdrawn, if you know what I mean. I'm not sure that the US could have stayed there, because they would have been there forever. So I think they probably had to withdraw. And maybe they shouldn't have been there in the first place. That would be another question. And if there's going to be a solution in Afghanistan, I think it has to come from within Afghanistan. But I mean, how that's going to happen, I really don't know, because it's not even like it's really one people, is it? It's a whole collection of different tribal loyalties and different warlords, and it certainly looks like a very difficult situation. But as I say, I'm not. I mean, they could perhaps have handled the withdrawal differently, but I'm not sure that they could have stayed. And it seems that the government, the kind of Western-backed government, was quite corrupt, and that there was a lot of problems with corruption in the army as well. And so I'm not sure there was another way forward. But it's certainly.
It seems to me that nobody there ever picked up a history book.
Yeah.
Because anybody who did so and studies the great game, as it was then called, between Britain and Russia,
Sure.
that the British had this odd notion they wanted to protect India from the Russian bear. And it turned out the Russian bear had absolutely no aspirations to do any such thing in Afghanistan. But they felt they had to do it, and they marched up in, 1846, marched 9,000 people to Kabul and took over Kabul, and then found it was a mess.
Yeah.
And all their advisors said, don't do this. This is stupid. People don't need you. They won't like you if you turn up, and that you shouldn't stick around. And bingo, there they were. And then eventually they had to retreat. And, the Afghans said it's dead simple. These are the conditions for retreat. You can either stay here and we'll massacre you over time, or you can leave, but you must leave your arms behind. Does this sound familiar?
Yeah.
That was the mid-19th century. Doesn't anybody have a history book?
Yeah. We don't understand them. We don't understand the country, and I think that's the problem. And that's not confined to Afghanistan. It's been a problem in lots of places. But I do feel very sorry for the people there. And could I just mention one thing, which is I think there are some organisations that are doing good work to help, and one of them is the Inaugural Foundation, which is based up on Lewis, and they really have done great work to help women and girls in Afghanistan, doing things like taking them hill walking to build their sort of self-esteem and self-confidence, and training women doctors, and so that's really, I think, maybe that's a better way to help than it's obviously at small scale, but it's kind of real concrete help for the people who need it.
Well, the likelihood is that the state as we understand it may not survive, because as you said, a lot of it is clan-based. People, from what I've read, it would seem to me that the Taliban would be very badly advised if they thought that they could somehow create some sort of unified arrangement here without the specific approval of the clan chiefs. And everyone in the past who's tried to do that has failed. So that it'll be very interesting to watch how this particular arrangement works out.
Yeah, and it's a very young population, I think, isn't it? So perhaps there's some hope in that. Perhaps there will be a new generation coming through that can perhaps find an internal solution to the problems.
Yeah, and it may well be that even though it may be their wish to relegate women to a different status, they might find that that's not going to be quite as straightforward as they found it in the past. Because I think the world has turned now. I think the world has moved on.
Yeah.
And there's lots of bright, able people out there who are, I suspect, have their own views on what the future of Afghanistan is going to be.
That's right.
It may not at all conform to what the Taliban have in mind.
Well, that's right. And you can't uneducate people. Once they've been educated, that's it. And people perhaps won't accept it, and that would be a way forward as well.
We've had a question asking for your views on the royal family and a future independent Scotland.
Right.
Do you have a view?
I do, yeah. Well, it's very simple. I'm not a monarchist. I don't think that we should have a royal family in the United Kingdom, and I don't think that we should have a royal family in an independent Scotland. I think it's a bit of a nonsense, really, and especially with the Queen. Obviously, she's put in a good shift and so on, and credit to her. But I don't think that her successor is going to be quite the same. Whoever it is going to be quite the same sort of person, and it all relies on nobody knowing what she thinks, doesn't it? And we do know what Prince Charles thinks and what other people think, even if we don't want to know. And so I think it really, it's time to knock it on the head. Have something different, have something modern and democratic. And in a way, I think the royal family actually is part of the weirdness and the problematicness, that's not really a word, but of the United Kingdom.
Yeah, I again, when I'm overseas and trying to describe to people the arrangements, particularly the monarchy and the House of Lords and the role that they serve, people well, particularly Americans, say to me, "Well, what's wrong with having all that pomp and pageantry?" So it's the thing we miss. We often go to London just to see all this stuff.
Yeah.
And then I explain, yeah, but the monarch has a constitutional role. Really? Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah. No.
I explained that, I mean, formally, she appoints the prime minister. It's her prime minister. It's not the citizens' prime minister. There are no citizens that are subject.
Yeah.
And they just can't get their head around that. They think, well, if it's flummery, it's perfectly okay.
Yeah.
But if it's going to be constitutional, well, that's just not on.
That's not on. Well, if they like it so much, they could buy it and put it in the middle of the desert like they did, London Bridge or whatever it was.
I remember reading once that just after independence was secured in the American states, they had a debate about what to call George Washington. And before they settled on the word president, and one was king. And the person who scotched that idea was George himself, who said, "That's the most loathsome suggestion I've ever heard in my life. Yeah. And if I'm offered that role, I will not accept it." Yeah. So you have to go back to the drawing board and come up with something more sensible. Yeah. But it's interesting that despite the fact that they'd had this enormous war and enormous change, and they still had a hankering after the titles. The flummery was still important to some people. Yeah, it's interesting that I think it's kind of not very grown up, really. Having a monarchy, it's all the kind of sycophancy and it's kind of quite false as well. It's all kind of a bit of a lie. We're all supposed to pretend that these people have got some magic fairy dust around them when patently they don't, and in the case of some members of the family, it's clearer than others. There was something terribly ironic too at the First World War when both sides had a head of state that they both felt was descended from God. I mean, and nobody thought that was terribly weird.
Yeah. Awkward, yeah.
Which, I mean, it's just part of all this bizarreness that you were talking about. I want to move on to something else because we've got about 7 minutes to go, Fiona. Oh, by the way, can I just satisfy myself on a piece of something that was peripheral that came up earlier? Was your name originally Fiona Bruce?
No, it wasn't. No, my mother's name is Bruce. My mother's maiden name is Bruce, but no, I wasn't originally Fiona Bruce.
Oh, okay, I just wondered about that because you mentioned Bruce earlier, and I just connected the two. Now you've got you've got a couple of books coming up. Is that right?
Well, I'm finishing. I mean, I've been saying this for a while, and I hope I won't be saying it for too much longer. I'm finishing a second novel, and I'm going to do a non-fiction book about the Outer Hebrides, sort of a bit about lockdown, and it's going to be a kind of walk-along, a sort of ruminative walks around the Outer Hebrides.
Terrific. And who's publishing that?
Berlin is publishing that book. It's going to be called A Place Like This, and Berlin's publishing it. And I chose that title because people are always saying, "How do you, where do you get your car MOT'd in a place like this? How do you manage for herbs and spices, in a place like this?" And in fact, you can get almost everything you want. Yeah, to Hebrides.
And your novel, you say you're finishing your novel. What's that going to be about?
Yeah, it's set in a kind of imaginary religious situation, a kind of dystopia, and it's a sort of it's kind of alternative Glasgow, where this kind of dystopian religious cult has taken hold, or it's taken hold elsewhere in the world, and it's starting to take hold in Glasgow. So it's kind of about that, and it's about it's partly about freedom of speech, which is one of my bugbears, and how we try to cramp it, and also about sort of direct action and citizens doing things for themselves.
That sounds exciting. And is that scheduled to come out sometime soon?
Well, I need to finish it first, and then I'm kind of hoping my agent's not watching, so he'll be thinking, when are you going to finish it, Fiona? I need to finish it first and send it to him, and then we need to find a publisher for it. So that's not as, it's not as tidy as the book about the Outer Hebrides.
Yeah, I understand that. Thinking about freedom of speech, and I know it's very important to you, as you said. How do you feel freedom of speech is operating in Scotland? We know some of the things on the legislation coming out of Westminster is deplorable in this regard.
Yeah.
But what about Scotland? Do you feel that there are constraints on? I mean, I'm thinking not only of Craig Murray and his imprisonment, but just broadly speaking.
Well, I think we've slightly lost our way with it. I mean, to be honest, I think Craig Murray, broke the law. I think that in a way that's not a freedom of speech issue. He wasn't jailed for saying what he thought about the salmon trout. He's entirely welcome to say that if he was jailed for contempt of court. And I think it was pretty blatant, and I think that's fair enough. And the jail term he received was kind of pretty much in the middle of what he could have received. So although I'm a member of Scottish Pen, I didn't support their decision to kind of come out in defence of him. I think, he broke the law. If I break the law, I must face the consequences. And if a plumber also face the consequences. So
that also apply to Julian Assange? Because he broke the law and he's been imprisoned. Do you feel the same about him?
To be honest, I don't have really strong views about Julian Assange, and it's not something that I followed very closely. I don't have huge sympathy for him, but I wouldn't really like to. I don't think I'm not across it enough to really comment on that. So I think I'd probably be chary of saying anything about that.
Do you think there ought to be a statement? I mean, we don't have a written constitution for Scotland, which is deplorable, but even one on the stocks, apparently. But would you feel that freedom of speech ought to be explicit in any constitution?
Yes, I do feel that, because I think it's an absolutely fundamental pillar of democracy and freedom. And I wonder if it's because we're moving to a position where the generation that experienced the Second World War is kind of dying out. That's going out of living memory. And I mean, obviously, we had all the communist countries where there was limits on freedom of speech, but I think we're forgetting how important it is, and it's absolutely fundamental. And yes, I think it should be enshrined in any future constitution.
Well, I think very few people would argue with you on that.
Oh, I don't know.
Oh, really? Well, I find that quite troubling. Yeah, that's very worrying. Well, we're almost up, Fiona. I'd like to thank you very much and very sincerely. The time, as I said at the beginning, goes very fast. But this has been very enjoyable. It's been enlightening. And I hope everyone has enjoyed it as much as I have. I just want to make a few closing remarks about the shows in the future, if I may. A big thank you to everyone out there for joining us tonight. As I said, I hope you've enjoyed the show as much as I have. As ever, we have a formidable range of guests lined up for future shows. As I always say, this is the place for the big hitters. And remember, you can find out what's happening on India Live and on the TNT Show by going to the whatsonguide.scot. We are back next week at the same time with another special guest, James Hawes, who recently wrote that, quote, "Time holds the Union cold and dying, full stop. Come the thaw, comma, it falls," close quotes. Join us next week and you'll learn more about what James thinks of the Union and why he thinks it's dying and, in fact, is, in many respects, has actually already failed. And as always, please look out for my Constitution column in the Sunday National this weekend. I'll be talking a little bit more about James Thaw's views on the Union and why he thinks there is such a thing as the England delusion. Very few people, in fact, have turned their attention to this, and I think you'll find what he has to say very interesting next week, and I hope you can catch up with the column. As always, please support Indie Live and Indie Live Radio, and particularly if you like the TNT show. Thanks again for joining us tonight, and a big thank you to Fiona. Join us next Wednesday, and remember, it's been a great day for British democracy. We hear that the food shelves will be more likely to be empty by Christmas because of Brexit. But chocolate apparently is produced several years in advance. So there'll be loads of chocolate for the kids if there's not enough fruit for the rest of us, who knows. So to all of you, thanks for joining us tonight. Stay safe, take care, and I look forward to seeing you next week.